Okay, so just I want to talk about infrastructure and globally. I will just whiz through this because I just want to show you it's not just Australia. United Nations, Rockefeller Foundation and others team up together to build urban resilience. There was the Addis Ababa Action Agenda in 2015, a United Nations initiative, Financing for Development, and Australia was part of this. So they're talking about strengthening public policies, so all the government policies and finance at all levels, unlocking the transformative potential of people and the private sector and incentivising changes in financing as well as consumption and production patterns to support sustainable development. So there's always this thing, the United Nations is coming down with their, corporate partnerships, and they're telling government how to, change legislation and put things into policy. It's basically all our government is doing, because I have read many government plans and you can always find the master plan at the United Nations. Establishing a new forum to bridge the infrastructure gap, investing in sustainable and resilient infrastructure to bridge the global infrastructure gap, including the $1 trillion to $1.5 trillion annual gap in developing countries. So this infrastructure gap is enormous. How blended finance. So the government talks about innovative financing. If you just look for innovative financing or transform, no, they don't call it. It's always innovative and this blended financing. So this is the G20, and the G20 Australia is part of, and this was how blended finance can reorient cautious private investors to infrastructure. After decades of private sector growth, private capital holds most available global finance. The rise of private wealth coincided, strangely enough, with the decline of public wealth in developed countries, which now hold zero or even negative shares in total wealth due to significant public debt burdens, i.e. our governments are broke because all the money's gone into the private sector's hands. So global public debt reached 90% of GDP in 2022, which was spurred along very much by the pandemic measures, a dramatic increase from the 30% recorded in the early 1970s. So against that backdrop, because governments are broke, private capital mobilisation has taken centre stage as a solution to bridge the infrastructure financing gap of around $3 trillion a year. And so again, mobilise private capital. And to do this, governments are seeking to take things even further, calling for innovative and scalable blended finance approaches, including de-risking instruments and solutions that most effectively use limited public funds to maximise private capital investments. So we're paying for private capital investments, which and it's got to be de-risked for those companies to take it on. So it's the government's being very nice to private corporations. Okay, so just quickly, this is the UNDRR, United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, making risk-informed decisions on infrastructure investments. Principles for resilient infrastructure, and I won't read this out, but there's been many, reports coming through. There's many reports coming through, and through COP26 about the increasing urgency for action. And so if mobilised, infrastructure investments would not only replace ageing infrastructure, but also establish new and much needed infrastructure systems. So we're talking about ageing infrastructure as well. We're talking about our roads. We're talking about things that used to be in public, or so far are in public hands. And they assist the public and private sectors in making risk-informed policy and investment decisions and attracting funds from the private sector. And that's, you just read that over and over again. People are going to have to pay a lot more, e.g. via taxes for resilient infrastructure. And there's going to need to be continuous improvement. So it's not just that you can live in a place and think, okay, I can handle it for a little while. It's continuous improvements. The modelling can be geared up however it wants to be, and you'll be paying more and more for additional infrastructure upkeep. So we've got the road. This is an interesting, if you want to go and have a look more on the International Coalition for Sustainable Infrastructure, they've got a lot of reports on there. They've got one about bushfire where they're talking about no longer trying to mitigate bushfires, but more just that people are prepared to leave. So we also need to look at all with this climate change modelling, what's the difference? Does the government start to have different policies around how they manage risks within the natural environment, and then how that leads to people having more potential disaster, because that's another part of it that's not talked about very much. So they want nature positive solutions for infrastructure, focusing on coastal and marine ecosystems, coastal communities, ports and offshore, nearshore renewable energy. So this nature positive solutions I'll come to. We've got the disaster risk reduction in Australia, and just that factors, climate resilient infrastructure and planning frameworks, and digital connectivity and infrastructure. So I won't talk about the digital infrastructure that's coming through, but it's a massive part of it. Then we've got the CSIRO, the Enabling Resilience Investment Framework. And now I want to just go on to the local government. So this is New South Wales, but it would be very similar. This is their submission into the inquiry into the ability of local governments to fund infrastructure and services. Most councils are reporting a deterioration in their financial position, and many fear that they are financially unsustainable or approaching unsustainability. And this is more in the smaller rural and regional areas who are more vulnerable. So in New South Wales, 54 out of 128 councils are recording a deficit. So they want, in New South Wales, flexibility in being able to charge more for people living in the council area, and that, they just make the thing that council's no longer just about rates and rubbish, roads, rates and rubbish, but now has to, more and more has been forced onto local council and taken out of, state and federal hands and put onto local council without being given any extra or enough money to be able to do all the services they've been tasked with. So they want to be able to charge a lot more for people to live in the area, and they have to include climate change considerations within this. So part of it is that there's been a total cost shift to councils of $1.36 billion in 21 to 22. So this is where, the different layers of government play their part in putting pressure on down to our local area. Councils are often involved at the front lines of disaster recovery and restoration. Adequate levels of asset renewals are an important lever for safeguarding against future environmental disasters and other shocks. So they're talking about the infrastructure needed and the assets. And this financial constraints limit a council's capacity to prepare for and respond to natural disasters. So then we get to this article, at the edge of the cliff, planning for Australia's ageing infrastructure. Many councils don't have the funds to jump on repairing things. They need to program the work where the funds are available. And they're talking, water, sewerage, infrastructure. It was built in the 1970s. The roads are pretty bad now. I don't know if they are where you are, but ours are all full of potholes. So we're reaching an infrastructure cliff. Risks associated with ageing infrastructure are compounded by the pressure caused by Australia's ever-growing population and the impact of increasingly frequent weather events. And so we've got the Infrastructure Australia Amendment Act went through in 2023. And this allows the Infrastructure Australia to identify any impediments to investment in nationally significant infrastructure and identify strategies to remove these impediments. Infrastructure Australia. The environment in which infrastructure is planned, delivered and operated has changed significantly over time. So climate change, extreme weather events, global availability of resources and materials, and changing movement patterns, which is, people coming into the country and moving around the country, can create an environment of risk and uncertainty. And this is all about needing this sort of infrastructure for the climate change modelling. So I think I'll just skip through it a bit. I just want to show you that it's in the plans, that this aging assets is constantly talked about, and then the principles for innovative financing by the Australian government, critical transport infrastructure. Yeah, so this is more talking about critical transport, but it's also more with, it's broader than this. This will require active partnerships with state and local governments and the private sector. Now we've got just to show what's happening. I won't. There's a video. There's an interview I've got on my Substack with Larry Fink, who is the CEO and the founder of Blackrock, who has $13 trillion in assets under management. So they've just bought Global Infrastructure Partners for $12.5 billion. And he says, Larry Fink, the global need for infrastructure combined with high deficits constraining government spending creates unprecedented opportunity for private capital to invest in infrastructure. And there's a video where he talks about that for 7 minutes. Governments are broke and private corporations are going to take over infrastructure.
Joining us right now, first on CNBC interview is BlackRock CEO Larry Fink, as this news is just crossing the tape. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Andrew. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year
to Becky and to Joe.
Let's talk about what's happening here. There has been speculation for months that there would be a major transaction in the future of BlackRock.
Yes.
A lot of people had speculated you would buy a private equity firm. This is a very different deal. You're sort of zigging where others may have been zagging.
Yes.
This is going to make you probably one of, if not the largest infrastructure investors in the world.
It'll put us in the top few. Well, thank you. Let me be clear. We were not looking at any private equity firms. We believe the future in the private markets is going to be infrastructure. As you think about BlackRock, over 65% of our clients are retirement assets. What can be a better asset than long duration assets, high coupon, inflation protected, and then you overlay the needs of governments and companies. I've been long advocating that deficits matter. And the future of governments funding their deficits on their own balance sheet is going to become more and more difficult. And we're in conversation with many governments of doing more public-private type of transactions. We are seeing more and more corporations, instead of selling divisions, they're selling blocks of assets, sometimes 100%, sometimes 50%, and going into partnership as they build out their infrastructure. We all know the need of recalibrating our power grid as we digitize everything. We all know that more and more countries are focusing on energy independence, and some of them are focused on decarbonization. All across these investments, we're talking trillions of dollars. And so we believe the big macro trend in the future is going to be much heavier reliance on private capital, retirement assets, to co-invest with companies and governments in infrastructure. We have had a long relationship with GIP. Bio, the founder, and I have been...
Bio Ogundlesi, who you knew from the First Boston days.
We were part of the First Boston diaspora.
Right.
We all left First Boston. We were partners together at First Boston. We've known each other. And this came together really rather quickly. We had a dinner together in September, and we saw the merits of it. We had our key partners together in October, and we moved very rapidly.
I should mention, Bio Ogundlesi has been the lead director at Goldman Sachs.
Yes.
And he's going to be stepping down as part of this, from that role.
So at the time of closing, and right after closing, Bio will be joining BlackRock's board, and at the same time, he will be standing down from the Goldman Sachs board. He's been the lead director, but he's been on the Goldman Sachs board now for, I think, approximately 12 years, and I know he's sad to leave a great firm, but I think he's very happy to be part of his new firm.
How does this change BlackRock? There was a transformational deal you did with BGI, brought in iShares years ago. That was a transformational transaction.
Yes. You
have put this, from what I was reading, in that same kind of bucket, that same kind of context.
Well, I would put it in the same context when we bought BGI, and iShares was part of it. iShares had $290 billion. Today, iShares is $3.5 trillion. These are just long-term trends that we see, long-term trends in how we see the markets are going to evolve. much of this, we've made a fundamental belief that the world's capital markets, and this is very good for CNBC, that the world's capital markets are going to become a larger and larger component of economic activity across countries, across the globe. And as I said, if we are going to really elevate our infrastructure as a world and the need for stronger, better airports, power grids, infrastructure as an asset class is must grow, and we believe that we are seeing that. And so we are making a large statement that we believe in the private markets, the future growth in infrastructure is going to be faster than almost any other.
And the bet that you can grow this business, I imagine, by bringing on all the investors who've historically backed you before to put you in a place to compete against the Brookfields of the world.
Our investors already have been notified. They are really excited about this transaction. They see the merits. Combined Blackrock's infrastructure team and the GIP team, we will now have over $150 billion in infrastructure. And we see more and more opportunity. We're working right now with 2 or 3 major companies that are looking to restructure themselves. And we're talking $4 or $5 billion of equity needed to do these infrastructure deals. We're in conversation with the government right now that they're looking to transform some of their power grids. And so all of these things are requiring not a few hundred million, but a few $1 billion. So the need is going to be greater, and the power of GIP and Blackrock really allows us to be in the front of the pack.
How should investors think about this morning in terms of alternatives? How big a piece or small piece on a relative basis this is going to be to your overall earnings picture in the future? What kind of multiple they want to apply to this kind of business relative to the iShares business? It's a complicated picture.
Well, it doubles our fee-related revenues related to our private markets. It's going to put us over $1.5 billion, which is a big block it's still small to an $18+ billion revenue platform, but it really is giving us a larger engine. If you add what we're doing now in iShares crossed over $1.5 billion in revenues too. So it is these platforms that really, in my mind, identify the strength of BlackRock, that we're able to bring the totality of investment ideas with investment technology. And this gives us a much bigger conversation beyond public securities, public equity, public debt, investment technology, the utilization of ETFs across all the spectrum, and then now being a large player in the infrastructure private markets business. Right.